Hello and welcome to another review lecture. This one is on empire building, and I'm going to go through each of the different time periods and talk about some of the empires in specific. So all empires are the same in that they all conquer, they all develop some type of nationhood. And what I mean by that is that if you're going to take over other people, because an empire is where you conquer other culture groups. That's kind of the basic definition of what an empire is. In order to control those other cultural groups, you have to find a way to make the people loyal to the new ruler and loyal to the new emperor. So there's several different ways that empires have done that, but they all have to accomplish this. If they don't, then they're more likely to have some type of rebellion early on in their reign, and then they won't necessarily be an empire anymore. They also have to reorganize the vast lands that they're conquering. They have to figure out a way to politically control the people. They have to centralize their power in some way. They also have to deal with the previous elites and the previous rulers. The way that they do this, different empires do this, is very different from each other in that some empires are going to use the local elites, some empires just kill the previous elites. There's all kinds of different ways that they can do that. They also have to figure out how to run the empire. They have to fund building projects. They have to fund their military, and you have to figure out a way to pay for all of that. And then they have to build infrastructure. Infrastructure meaning public buildings. They have to deal with irrigation systems. They have to build roads. The roads are not only just for economic purposes like trade, but they also need to build roads so that they can move their military around. How they do all these different things are very, very different. And we're going to look at a bunch of different empires in specific so that you can kind of get a better idea. Our four classical age empires, and our classical age is when we're talking about 600 BCE to 600 CE. We're looking at Persia, Rome, Mauryan and Gupta, and the Chen Han. So Persia existed in the Middle East from 550 BCE to 330 BCE. So the Persian Empire is contemporaries with the Greeks. So Persia didn't exist when Rome was rising, basically. Persia is going to take control of most of the Middle East, and they could not get past the Mediterranean Sea because of the problems with the Greek city-states. That's kind of the cool part about the Greek city-states. Even though the Greek city-states were not an empire, they were never unified, they're able to defend themselves from a big Persian empire. In order to develop nationhood, they actually are going to make people loyal to the central king, but they're not going to force anyone to change religion or change their language or anything else. They allowed religious and cultural tolerance, which actually made the people more willing to be a part of the Persian Empire. So why were people willing to be in the Persian Empire? First off, it was more of an economic issue. The Persian Empire adds a lot of trade and a lot of stability so that they can trade further distances. Secondly, the Persian kings were benevolent. They were nice. They took care of infrastructure. They took care of irrigation system. They built roads. So they advanced things for people, and people didn't necessarily have an issue with that. Also, this area in the Middle East had had quite a lot of turmoil in regards to who was in charge. In the previous time period, you had the Akkadians and the Babylonians and the Chaldeans and just all these other people that were in charge, and so the Persians actually create stability, and so people are more willing to allow themselves to be under their rule. How they organized the territory into satrapies, and they put a satrap in charge of each region. Most of the time that satrap was local. Most of the time that satrap was one of those local elites that had already been in place. So a lot of times the satrap was not Persian. They deal that if the satrap wasn't loyal to the king, then they would just replace him. In order to make money to run the empire, they did use a complex system of taxation, but really they were encouraging trade by doing things like building the royal road, and they developed a huge central coinage system. And Persia obviously is going to take that from the Greeks, but that is going to stabilize the economy quite a bit in this region. They built 4 capital cities throughout the empire. They spent a season in each one of the 4 capital cities. This gave them an opportunity to see their entire empire, which is something that is difficult to do this early on, 550 to 330 BCE. And then, of course, the royal road was built. This royal road was built for troop movement, for the movement of the king, the emperor, for movement of goods and products and services. And so Persia as a whole created a very stable empire. Here's the geographical extent of the Persian Empire. You can see it's right smack dab in the middle of the Middle East. They conquered the Tigris Euphrates, modern-day Syria. They actually do get down into Egypt and into Anatolia, but again, they were unable to conquer the Greek city-states. Rome, the Roman Empire is from 27 BCE to 476. There's two parts to Roman history. One is the Republic. The Republic was established with the whole mythology of Romulus and Remus. But Rome, the Roman Empire, was established after a bunch of wars between several generals, including Julius Caesar. So the actual first emperor of Rome is not named emperor until 27 BCE. That was Augustus. That was Julius Caesar's nephew. And the Roman Empire is going to last until its western fall in 476. On the next slide, you'll see the map of Rome, but Rome was one of the largest empires the world's ever seen. And part of that is because of their wartime technology. They were really good at troop movement. They were really good at building bridges and walls and things of that nature. So they're going to be able to conquer quite a lot of land. To develop nationhood, they actually created a program called Romanization. Romanization was this process of people wanting to be a part of the Roman Empire, and because of that, they're going to do things like learn Latin, they're going to learn the religion, they're going to learn the culture of the Romans, and they're going to spread this Roman culture all throughout Europe, which ultimately will lead to the development of the Romance languages through the Middle Ages. So they used language quite a bit to create their nationhood. They organized their territory into provinces, and each province was in the hands of a governor, and that governor basically was directly handpicked by the Roman emperor, and if that governor started to be aggressive or got out of line, he would be removed from office and the Roman emperor would send a new one in. This happened quite often. As far as the previous elites or the rulers, usually they just killed the previous elite as they were conquering. But most areas actually wanted to become part of the Roman Empire, and so there wasn't a lot of fighting. And sometimes those territories, the leaders, would kind of acquiesce to the Roman Emperor and then ultimately maybe become the governor of the territory. They encouraged trade on a large scale. Obviously, Rome is on the receiving end of the Silk Road, and the Romans are going to do a ridiculous amount of road building, which allowed for the movement of goods and products. And they allowed the troops to loot, meaning when they conquered, when the generals would go into an area and conquer, the troops were allowed to take whatever goods and they wanted, whatever gold, silver, whatever they found in the area that they were conquering, and that's how the troops were paid. They didn't necessarily. That was one thing about the Roman government, is that they didn't have to pay their troops directly because the conquerors were allowed to get the spoils of war. Their infrastructure building was amazing. They had the Appian Way, they had concrete, they had aqueducts. The aqueducts provided fountains for everyone to get clean water, built walls and forts and things of that nature. Obviously, they had huge amphitheaters and the Colosseum. They built temples. They did a lot of building to show the greatness of the Roman Empire, and that's part of that developing of nationhood. As long as people had food and people had water, they were pretty happy. You can see that this shows you the different parts of the empire up to 180 AD. The reason why this map stops at 180 is because that's when the end of the Pax Romana, and so the Roman Empire starts to lose territory after 180. So 180 is the height of the Roman Empire. The Mauryan and Gupta empires in India, they were not actually conquering empires. Both these empires really developed a system of alliances rather than conquering. Hinduism created nationhood for them. They didn't really have to work hard to create any type of cultural unity with India because the religion and the caste system already did that for them. Like I said, they used an alliance system rather than a centralized system, and the organization of the land was based off of the caste system. So the upper caste were were put in charge under the Mauryan and Gupta, and there was no reshuffling of society. And so really the Mauryan and Gupta were just empires that said, hey, we'll protect you in exchange for you saying that we're kings, and everybody was kind of happy with that. They did use a tribute system to run the empire, so a lot of these territories sent tribute to the capital city for the Mauryan and Gupta, and they didn't really have to build any infrastructure simply because the people did that on their own. Here's the distribution of both the Mauryan and the Gupta Empire, and you can see that the Gupta really did not get into central or southern India at all. They did take some coastal regions, and the Mauryan obviously did get into the Middle East a little bit, like up into Afghanistan, but that's it. The central part and the southern part of India is very difficult to control. The Qin and Han, you have another review for China that you can check for both of these empires. So the Qin won the Warring States period, and the Han expanded and used the tribute system in order to establish control. The Qin are going to use fear and spies, and the Han use Confucianism to create nationhood. They're both going to use the mandate of heaven as a way to legitimize their rule. They organize the system. The Qin are the ones who really organize the provinces, and then the Han keep that system in place. They are going to make the previous rulers generals or court advisors, or they just got rid of them. The Han was the height of the Silk Road, so money was no issue, and they did spend a lot of time building roads and walls in order to achieve greatness for their empires. Here you can see the extent of the Qin Empire. That Great Wall that's displayed on the map is something that is more the Ming Great Wall, but Emperor Shihwandi did start that wall. And then, of course, you can see the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty had two capitals, Chang'an and Luoyang. Chang'an was more... Chang'an was the capital city used more by the Tang. They're the ones who really built it up as an actual capital city. Your medieval empires are the Byzantine, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate, and then the Mongols. The Byzantine Empire was what was left of the Eastern Roman Empire. Some emperors did actually regain some Western Roman territories, and you'll see that on the map on the next slide. As far as their nationhood goes, they used the Eastern Orthodox Church and Cyrillic writing to kind of unite the people, and they also got people distracted with the Roman-type games. They had the hippodrome, they still did chariot races and things like the Romans had already done. They're going to use Greek as their language for the Byzantine Empire, which is why their writing is Cyrillic rather than the phonetic writing that is used by Western Rome. They reorganized the territory into provinces, and of course we have the Justinian Law Code being written early on in 527 during his reign, and the Law Code will create stability for the territory. There wasn't an issue with the previous elite and the rulers because this is just what was left of the Roman Empire. There wasn't necessarily anything that they had to do in regards to controlling them. They were on the Black Sea, and of course they controlled Constantinople, which made them really economically sound in regards to trade and all of the goods and products that were going into these territories. Obviously, most of their infrastructure that they concentrated on was in the Constantinople itself. They built quite a lot in Constantinople, and Constantinople is one of the most diverse cities in the world, and so many people were coming in and out of it throughout this time period. Here you can see the Byzantine Empire to its greatest extent. You can see some of the boundaries that was established before Justinian, and then what Justinian was able to add. Justinian did manage to gain quite a lot of territory back after the fall of Rome in 476. So Justinian's ruling, about 100 years later, and he's going to be able to regain a lot of Western Rome. Now, keep in mind that the Byzantine Empire is going to kind of get weaker as these territories break off. The Byzantine Empire is going to have a hard time just controlling all of this and keeping all this under a centralized rule. The Umayyad Caliphate runs from 661 to 750. Caliphate just means Muslim empire. A caliphate is a theocracy where it is run by religious law, and so the Umayyads were Sunni. The Umayyad family was not related to Muhammad, and so they don't rule for very long because the Abbasids are going to be Shiite, and there's quite a large Shiite population that is going to follow the Abbasids. The Umayyad are going to conquer quite a bit. They actually cover 5.17 million square miles within the Middle East and into northern Africa, and they did fight the Byzantine Empire quite a bit. And when I was talking about the previous slide that they were unable to hold on to that territory, this is who they really lost it to. They get all the way into the Iberian Peninsula with Spain, but they do not go further into Europe because of the Battle of Tours. Charles Martel, the king of a province in modern-day France, is going to defend Europe and win the Battle of Tours in 732. As far as nationhood goes, they're going to use Islam as their unifying force, which makes sense. However, the different forms of Islam that were developing during this early part of the religious formation made it difficult for them to create a huge unified Muslim state. A lot of Muslims don't like their rule because they were Sunni, and they were very political in nature, and so there's a conflict here between the idea of a religion versus a political entity. The social structure also created tension under the Umayyads. You had your Muslim Arabs, and then you had Muslim non-Arabs who were underneath the Muslim Arabs, and then you had the non-Muslims, free people like the Christians, Jews and Zoroastrians, and then the slaves. And one of the things that really helped the Umayyad in conquering was the tax that the non-Muslim free people had to pay in order to continue to practice their religion. They did organize the land into provinces, and they had a governor who was handpicked by the caliph. But unfortunately, for the Umayyad, they were again unable to completely centralize the system because quite a bit of Arab tribes would revolt often. Damascus, which is in modern-day Syria, was the capital city. The Jews and Christians were still allowed to run their own systems of governments and laws as long as they paid the tax. So it's kind of like the tribute system. And they are going to employ Christians in their government positions. So they were trying to create some type of unity amongst the territory that they were conquering. They had a mass taxation system, and then of course they had the jizya, which is that tax that non-Muslims had to pay in order to continue their practice. They were able to use the previous empire structures, and so they didn't have to spend a lot of time and energy on the previous structures. And the Byzantine coinage was actually used throughout the caliphate, which added a little bit of economic stability for them. Here you can see the Umayyad Caliphate, and you can tell that what I was talking about, where the Byzantine Empire is going to lose a lot of lands as a result of the spread of the Umayyads. So they're going to basically take out northern Africa and go up into Spain. And then you can go up to the Loire River in France and see where the Battle of Tours was. And the Franks were going to be able to defend Europe as a whole, and that's why the Europeans are going to maintain Christianity rather than become Muslims. The Abbasid Caliphate lost a lot of land to the Byzantine Empire, and they used Shiite Islam as their unifier, and they organized themselves to be more Middle Eastern rather than European. Where the Umayyad were actually spending a lot of time and energy trying to get and infiltrate into Europe, the Abbasids went the other way. They created the Vizier office, which is kind of like a local governor, and the Vizier eventually had more power than the Caliph. The Caliph becomes more of a religious figure than a political figure towards the end of the Abbasid. The Abbasid are going to be taken out in 1258 by the Mongols. They are going to use Persian bureaucrats within their system, and again, that's very different from the Umayyad because they were going towards Asia rather than Europe. However, despite the political turmoil of the Abbasid, this is actually going to be a golden age for trade and building and architecture and arts and literature and nature. Here you can see the extent of the Abbasid and kind of what was added. You can see that the Umayyads are going to hold on to Spain. That's where the Muslims in Spain are going to remain in place until Isabella manages to push them out in 1492. And you can see that the northern Egypt is going to be under the direct control of the Abbasids as well. And then you can see where going to the right, to the east, doesn't totally work for them. They do get up to the caspian Sea, but that's about it. And this is where we're going to start developing all of our different tribal groups that we call the stands within the Central Asian territory. The Mongols have the largest land empire in history, and they don't have to develop nationhood because they're the Mongols. People were scared of them. They were horrible rulers, so they were great conquerors but horrible rulers. They organized themselves into the Khanate system, but they kept fighting with each other, and so the citizens that were under the Mongols really had a lot of freedom to do whatever they wanted. They paid tribute for the most part, and major cities like Kiev become collectors, which will ultimately give rise to the Rus. And we do have this time period of the Pax Mongolica, which restores Silk Road trade, ironically, despite their inability to really centralize their political system. As far as infrastructure goes, they developed a postal system, they revitalized roads that were already in place, and they created this kind of like idea of a hotel on the roads where traders were free to rest and find, it aided in trade in the Pax Mongolica trade. Here are the different khanates associated with the Mongol Empire. You have the Golden Horde, which was your Russian. You had the Ilkhanate, which was Persia. Remember that the Mongols are going to conquer Baghdad and take out the Abbasids in 1258. For the rest of the Middle East and into the Mediterranean, North African regions, it's really tribal. And then, of course, you have the Khanate of the Great Khan with Karakorum as the capital, and then the Yuan dynasty itself, that was Beijing was the capital. Modern empires are either sea-based or land-based. So our sea-based empires are Great Britain, France, Dutch, Portugal, Spain. Your land-based are the Ottomans, Safavid, Mughals, and Ming. Where did the United Kingdom go? They went everywhere. They were really good at developing nationhood by spreading the use of English. And they organized themselves into the Commonwealth. But really it depends on where they went and how they dealt with that territory. The British did not use one type of colonization or imperialism. They dealt with the different regions in different ways. So they had indirect rule of India for a lot of India's history, but then they were more aggressive when they were controlling the colonists in what will become the United States. So you need to look at that in particular if you're unfamiliar with all of that. Huge mercantilistic policy where the colonies and the imperialist areas are going to make a lot of money for the British, and as the Industrial Revolution happened, the British are going to take industrialization to all of their colonies and all of their imperialized areas. Here is the extent of the British Empire after the U.S. independence. So you can see that they had quite a lot of land in Africa, and they will actually build a railway system that goes from Cairo all the way down to South Africa in Johannesburg. You can see India. India was not just India. They actually controlled Pakistan, Bangladesh, into Nepal. They had some territory in Southeast Asia as well, which will create conflict between the French and the British over there. You can see that they had territory in the Arabian Peninsula, Australia, of course, and coastal areas on the coast of Africa, and then their islands in the Caribbean as well. So their empire is vast, and this right here is why we all speak English. France is going to conquer Canada, a bunch of islands, but they really focus on Southeast Asia. This is Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and of course West Africa. Most of these territories still speak French today. A lot of these territories are Catholic. The French did allow for quite a lot of missionary work within their empire. They organized pretty much everything into provinces, especially territories like Canada. There wasn't really any previous elites to deal with. The modern imperialism is very different from medieval or previous empire building, and they use mercantilism as well. here are your French territories as far as being part of the empire. Spain, you can go to the Latin America Review lecture to look a little bit more at Spain. Obviously, they conquered the New World with Cortez and Pizarro. They are really good at nationhood building in regards to changing the culture of the territories that they conquer. So that's why Mexico South speaks Spanish. That's why Mexico South is Catholic. They organize into a very centralized system with the viceroy system. So this is where Spain is very different from Great Britain and the French. They use a lot more direct control, but the Spanish were not part of the second wave of colonization with imperialism. The Spanish really were successful in the first part, and then they actually went broke and were unable to successfully participate in the second part simply because they were conquered by Napoleon. They lost other territories pretty early on, and then of course the inflation caused by the silver trade. Portugal did the same thing as Spain. One territory that Portugal did things a little differently was in Africa. They negotiated with African leaders already in place and left them in charge. And so the Portuguese were really kind of overlords for different territories within Africa. Here are your maps of the Spanish and the Portuguese empires. You can see that the Spanish gets a little confusing and that they did have territories within like the Holy Roman Empire for a little while, but that is going to change as modern Spain, as those territories become a little bit more independent. So Portugal really has mostly your coastal regions of Africa. They have some ports in India and in Asia as well, and then of course all of Brazil. The Ottomans, we have three gunpowder empires that we need to talk about for this time period. The Ottomans, the Safavid, and the Mughals. The Ottomans are going to use gunpowder weapons and take out Constantinople, which will end the Byzantine Empire in 1453. They did fight with the Safavid on the eastern side. Of course, they were somewhat more successful, but because the Ottomans spent a lot of time focusing on Europe, they never really conquered that far into the Middle East. If they had shifted their resources, they probably could have been able to take out the Safavid. They are unsuccessful in Europe. As you know, they were unable to capture Vienna because Charles V is going to be able to defend Europe, and they often fight with Russia throughout this time period, and they're basically fighting over control of the Black Sea. Catherine the Great had a great victory in the Black Sea region. Of course, then there's the Crimean War in the 1850s. So they're constantly fighting for that territory along the Black Sea. They're going to use Islam as their nationhood, of course, and spread the Turkish language with the Cyrillic alphabet. They're going to use local rulers, and they create a military organization called the Janissaries. And the Janissaries are going to use a Dersham system where they basically kidnap little boys and turn them into nice little Muslim soldiers. This will ultimately backfire as the Janissaries end up more powerful than the Ottoman sultans, and we have several points in history where the Ottoman sultan faces revolt from the Janissaries until the Janissaries are ultimately taken out towards the end of the Ottoman Empire. But at that point, the Ottomans were already the ultimate man of Europe, and so they weren't going to be able to hold on to the land for much longer. One of the biggest issues that the Ottomans had for organization was their succession. Because of the harem system, there were all kinds of people that could have taken the throne, and so there's often mass murders of the emperor's family going on in the palace that the Ottomans tried to conceal and keep within the palace. They allowed, again, people of non-Muslim religions to practice as long as they paid a tax, and they do keep local rulers in place. They are trying to make a lot of money based off of Black Sea trading, but the biggest problem for them is that they don't modernize their territory. And as the Industrial Revolution happens, they don't have the funding to be able to modernize, and that will lead to part of their issue for their ending with World War I. There is a lecture on the Ottoman Empire. If you don't quite remember any of this, you can go back and watch that lecture as well. This is different time periods for the different acquisitions of the Ottoman territory from the 1300s up until 1683. They start to lose lands in the mid to late 1600s and will start to kind of continue to lose land as people like Muhammad Ali are going to declare Egypt independent. You have the development of the territories along the Balkan region as well, which will ultimately lead to World War I. Like I said, they're going to deal with the Russians in the Black Sea as they're fighting over this access with the Crimean Peninsula right there. And you can see Vienna along the Danube, which is where the Ottomans are never able to conquer that territory. One key trade route that they had was with Venice. Venice becomes super rich because of the trade associated with the Ottoman Empire. The Safavid were another gunpowder empire, but they weren't as good at spreading as some of the other empires were. They're good at maintaining their borders, but that's pretty much all they can do. They use a Kizilbash warrior system, and these warriors were very similar to the Janissaries. The Safavid were Shiite Muslims, and the Ottomans were Sunni, so there's constant fighting between the Safavid and the Ottomans. They are going to use Twelver Shiism and the Persian culture to create a cultural unity for Persia. This territory that once was Persia will maintain a lot of its Persian culture, where so that's where we're going to see differences with the practice of Islam between like what is being practiced in Syria versus what is being practiced in Afghanistan or in Iran. And they actually had a complex system of checks and balances, and they used governors to control the provinces. They made the previous elites and the rulers governors, and so people were fine with them being in charge. They did have a taxation system. One thing that the Safavid did do for this territory was lots and lots of building. They built Isfahan, the capital city, from scratch, and they have new architectural features and a different style from the Ottomans. So while Muslim in flavor, it was actually more Persian than Turkish. So in the Ottoman Empire, you're going to see a lot of Roman Turkish architecture, where in the Safavid, you're going to see more Persian architecture. This is the extent of the Safavid Empire. You can see that Shah Ismail is actually going to get quite into like Armenia and the Turkic Kurds and some of that Tigris and Euphrates River Valley part, but the Ottomans are going to regain that land, and this territory where you see the purple stripes is going to go back and forth between the Safavid and the Ottoman Empire throughout history. The Safavid are also going to have issues with the Uzbeks. Uzbekistan is currently obviously a state, and it's a tribal territory in this northeastern territory of the Safavid, and they're going to constantly fight over this region as well. The Mughal Empire in India was another gunpowder empire, but they're Muslim rulers in a Hindu land. And so the Muslims, the Mughal Empire had issue with nationhood as far as really controlling things. So they were kind of seen as overlords over the people. They weren't necessarily a solid centralized system, and they allowed the previous rulers to stay in charge and made them Rajputs and different princes and whatnot. The key to Mughal success was actually tolerance under Akbar. Akbar created the Divine Faith, which was this religion that was kind of a mix of everything that you could find in India. Aurangzeb, the last Mughal empire, actually tries to take out Hindu temples and whatnot, and that really leads to the fall of the Mughals. Couple of new infrastructures that were built. The Taj Mahal, obviously. Akbar builds a huge fort at Lahore. The different emperors under the Mughal kept moving their capital because they kept conquering, and they weren't necessarily, it's not something like with the Ottomans where they kept the capital at Istanbul. Again, there's a lecture specifically on the Mughal Empire if you want more information. Here you can see a map of the Mughal. You can see what Akbar added and then what Aurangzeb added. Aurangzeb will be taken out basically by local princes. What ends up happening is the British show up, and the British convince the Hindus that these Muslim overlords were not good for them, and they're going to create quite a lot of chaos. And so the Mughal Empire will end, and the local rulers will kind of end up being under control of the British, kind of by accident. For the Ming and the Qing, you can see the China Review lecture. I'm not going to review that again here. After World War I, empire building is seen as bad. People felt that one of the main causes of World War I was associated with imperialism and with military might and things of that nature. And so when you go empire building in the modern age, you are going to be controlled and put down. There's several examples of this. Germany during World War II. Putin and Russia has been an issue as of late, and so the G8 and the United States has been dealing with him and trying to contain him and keep him from empire building. The ISIL Caliphate's trying to reestablish some type of empire in the Middle East, obviously where the UN and a lot of the Western world is trying to prevent that from happening. Strong states like the United States now use influence and fear to create global control instead of actual land control. So, you know, there's a lot of countries out there who have that ability to blow someone up at any time, and that gives quite a lot of security to some of these larger states. And you can argue that they are empires just without land control.